A millionaire brought his mistress back home the day after his wife's funeral. The next day, the reading of the will changed everything. The rain fell softly over the sprawling cemetery, its gentle patter muffling the sound of grieving whispers. Richard Whittaker stood under a large black umbrella, his tailored suit immaculate as ever. To those gathered he seemed the epitome of composed mourning. His voice was steady as he delivered the eulogy, recounting cherished memories of his late wife, Margaret Whittaker, with an emotion that teetered between grief and guilt. "She was my rock," Richard said, his voice faltering for the first time. "The one who kept me grounded even when the storms of life threatened to tear me away." In the crowd, his adult children, Emma and Daniel Whittaker, exchanged glances. Emma's eyes brimmed with tears as she clutched a tissue, while Daniel stood stoic, his jaw clenched in silent support. Both felt the weight of their mother's absence, but neither could ignore the growing unease that had crept into their lives since her passing. At the edge of the gathering, a striking woman in her late 30s lingered beneath her own umbrella. Dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, Jessica Beaumont seemed out of place among the sea of familiar faces. Her presence had not gone unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd, speculating on her identity and her relationship with the Whittaker family. As the service ended and mourners began to disperse, Emma and Daniel approached their father. "Dad, you were wonderful," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out to squeeze his arm. Richard nodded, his face softening. "Your mother deserved nothing less." Daniel's gaze drifted toward the enigmatic woman lingering near the trees. "Who's she?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Richard followed his son's line of sight. For a moment his expression hardened, but it quickly gave way to something unreadable. "Jessica Beaumont," he said after a pause. "An old friend of your mother's." "Old friend?" Emma asked, frowning. "Mom never mentioned her." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "There's a lot about your mother's life you didn't know." With that he walked away, leaving Emma and Daniel to share a bewildered look. As the family returned to the Whittaker estate, a sprawling mansion that stood as a testament to Richard's wealth and success, the atmosphere grew more strained. The house, once filled with Margaret's warmth and light, now felt cold and imposing. The staff moved quietly, their faces somber as they served drinks and hors d'oeuvres to the remaining guests. Jessica, to everyone's surprise, was among them. "Why is she here?" Emma hissed to Daniel as they stood by the fireplace, their voices low. Daniel shrugged, his eyes narrowing as he watched Jessica move effortlessly through the room. "Dad invited her. That's all we know." Jessica approached them with a polite smile, her dark eyes glinting with something neither sibling could quite place. "Emma, Daniel," she said, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. Your father has spoken so much about you." Emma hesitated before shaking her hand. "I wish I could say the same." Daniel, ever the pragmatist, got straight to the point. "How exactly did you know our mother?" Jessica's smile didn't falter. "We were friends years ago. Life took us in different directions, but she was always dear to me." "Funny," Emma said, her tone laced with skepticism. "Mom was very open about her friends. Your name never came up." Before Jessica could respond, Richard appeared at her side. "Jessica will be staying with us for a while," he announced, his voice firm enough to brook no argument. "Staying?" Emma's voice rose an octave. "In Mom's house." "It's my house too," Richard said, his tone sharp. "And Jessica needs a place to stay while she gets back on her feet." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Jessica gave a small apologetic smile and excused herself, leaving the family to their brewing storm. Emma rounded on her father as soon as Jessica was out of earshot. "What are you thinking, Dad, bringing a stranger into this house right after Mom's funeral?" "She's not a stranger," Richard snapped. "And this is my decision." End of discussion. Daniel placed a calming hand on his sister's arm. "Emma, let's not do this now." Emma shook him off, her eyes blazing. "No, let's do this now. This is Mom's legacy and you're trampling all over it." Richard's face darkened. "Margaret is gone," he said coldly, "and how I choose to move forward is none of your concern." With that he turned and left the room, leaving his children stunned and speechless. That night the mansion was eerily quiet. Emma lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling as questions raced through her mind. Who was Jessica Beaumont? What was her real connection to their family? And why did her father seem so desperate to defend her? In the guest wing, Jessica unpacked her belongings with meticulous care. She paused to look at a framed photo she had brought with her, a younger version of herself with Richard, their smiles wide and carefree. Gently, she placed it on the bedside table and turned out the light, a small smile playing on her lips as she settled into bed. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Richard sat alone, staring at a portrait of Margaret that hung above the fireplace. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his thoughts, and for the first time in years he felt truly vulnerable. "Forgive me," he whispered into the silence. And so the first cracks in the Whittaker family began to form, the shadows of secrets and betrayals creeping ever closer. The morning after the funeral dawned gray and heavy, the sun struggling to break through the blanket of clouds. The Whittaker mansion, usually bustling with activity, was uncharacteristically quiet. The faint clinking of china in the kitchen was the only sign that life carried on. Emma and Daniel sat in the sprawling dining room, nursing cups of coffee. Neither spoke, their thoughts consumed by the events of the previous day. Jessica Bowman's unexpected presence and their father's strange behavior had left them both uneasy. "Do you think she'll actually stay?" Emma broke the silence, her voice tinged with frustration. Daniel shrugged, swirling his coffee absent-mindedly. "Knowing Dad, he'll dig his heels in just to prove a point. The question is, why her? Why now?" Before Emma could respond, the answer came in the form of footsteps clicking down the hallway. Jessica appeared, looking far too put together for someone who had just attended a funeral. Dressed in a fitted cream blouse and tailored slacks, she exuded an air of quiet confidence. "Good morning," she greeted, her tone pleasant but distant. Emma forced a polite smile. "Morning." Daniel nodded but said nothing, his eyes following Jessica as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She moved around the kitchen as if she'd lived there for years, completely at ease in the Whittaker family home. "I hope I'm not intruding," Jessica said, though her demeanor suggested she didn't truly care. "Richard insisted I stay, but if it's too much, I can make other arrangements." "No need," Emma replied, her words clipped. "It's clear you're here for the long haul." Jessica's lips curled into a faint smile. "I appreciate your understanding." Before the tension could escalate further, Richard entered the room. He was dressed casually in slacks and a sweater, his usually polished demeanor softened by exhaustion. "Good, everyone's here," he said, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "I wanted to let you know that Jessica will be staying in the guest wing for the time being. She'll have full access to the house." Emma's grip tightened around her coffee cup. "Full access?" "Yes," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's family now." "Family?" Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and incredulous. "Dad, with all due respect, we just buried Mom." "How can you say that?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Jessica was close to your mother, whether you knew it or not. She's going through her own grief, and I won't have her treated like an outsider." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're inviting a stranger into our home and expecting us to just accept it." "Enough," Richard's voice boomed, silencing the room. He turned to Jessica, his expression softening. "Why don't you get settled? I'll handle this." Jessica nodded and excused herself, leaving the room with an air of quiet triumph. As soon as she was out of earshot, Emma rounded on her father. "What's really going on here? Who is she to you?" Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I told you she was a friend of your mother's." "That's not good enough," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "We deserve the truth." Richard's eyes hardened. "The truth is that your mother is gone, and I won't let you dictate how I move forward. Jessica is staying, and that's final." Without waiting for a response, he left the room, leaving Emma and Daniel seething. Jessica's presence quickly began to alter the dynamic of the Whittaker household. By mid-afternoon, she had unpacked her belongings and made herself at home in the guest wing, a luxurious suite with a private sitting room and balcony. Emma and Daniel spent the day avoiding her, retreating to their own corners of the mansion to process their father's decision. But avoiding Jessica didn't mean she was out of their minds. That evening, the siblings met in the library, a space that had always been a refuge for them. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, its warm lighting a stark contrast to the tension brewing in the house. "I've been thinking," Emma began, pacing in front of the fireplace. "We need to find out who she really is." Daniel leaned back in one of the leather armchairs, his arms crossed. "You think she's hiding something, don't you?" Emma shot back. "Mom never mentioned her. And did you notice how she acted this morning, like she owns the place?" Daniel sighed. "Yeah, it's strange. But Dad seems convinced she's legit. Maybe we're overreacting." Emma stopped pacing and stared at him. "Do you really believe that? Or are you just afraid of what we might find?" Daniel didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. Meanwhile, in her suite, Jessica sat by the window, a glass of red wine in hand. She stared out at the sprawling gardens, the faint hum of the fountain in the distance providing a soothing backdrop. On the bedside table lay a stack of papers she had pulled from her luggage. Among them was a photograph of herself and Richard, taken years ago at an event neither Emma nor Daniel knew about. She ran a finger over the photo, her expression unreadable. "One step at a time," she murmured to herself, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Late that night, Emma couldn't sleep. Driven by a gnawing sense of unease, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Quietly, she crept down the hall toward the guest wing, her heart pounding in her chest. Reaching Jessica's door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Was she really about to invade someone's privacy? The faint sound of movement from inside the room spurred her on. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open a crack. Inside, she saw Jessica sitting at a desk, her back to the door. Spread out before her were papers Emma couldn't quite make out, but one detail caught her attention. The Whitaker family crest embossed on the top of a document. Emma's breath hitched. Jessica was going through their family's private documents. Before she could react, Jessica turned, her eyes meeting Emma's through the narrow gap in the door. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Jessica smiled. "Can't sleep, Emma?" Emma quickly shut the door and hurried back to her room, her mind racing. Whatever Jessica's intentions were, they weren't innocent, and Emma was determined to find out the truth. The next morning dawned with a brittle chill, the kind of atmosphere that seemed to seep into the very walls of the Whitaker mansion. Emma sat at the breakfast table, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She replayed the previous night over and over in her mind. Jessica sitting at the desk, the Whitaker family crest gleaming on that document, and the unsettling smile that seemed to confirm her suspicions. Daniel joined her a few minutes later, looking just as weary. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Emma shook her head. "She was in there last night, in her room, going through our family's papers." Daniel froze mid-pour, his eyes snapping to hers. "What kind of papers?" "I couldn't see much," Emma admitted, frustration seeping into her voice. "But there was a document with the family crest on it. She's digging into something, Daniel." He sighed, sinking into the chair across from her. "We need to tread carefully. If we accuse her outright and we're wrong, Dad will never forgive us." Emma leaned forward, her voice a low whisper. "And if we're right?" Daniel didn't answer. The uneasy truce in the house continued throughout the day. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, but her absence only heightened Emma and Daniel's sense of urgency. By mid-afternoon, Emma found herself in the attic, a place she hadn't ventured into in years. The space was dusty and dimly lit, filled with relics of the past, old furniture, trunks of photographs, and boxes labeled with dates and events. She rummaged through the boxes labeled Richard's office until she found what she was looking for: a stack of old documents neatly tied together with twine. Among them were several contracts and personal notes, but one envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to Jessica Beaumont. Heart-pounding, Emma opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's. "Dear Jessica, I've thought long and hard about this decision. You've been patient and understanding, and for that I'm grateful. With Margaret's condition worsening, I can no longer ignore what we've shared. When the time comes, I want you to be a part of this family, as we always dreamed. I'll ensure everything is prepared. Yours, Richard." Emma's hands trembled as she read the letter. It was dated just 2 months before her mother's diagnosis, a revelation that sent a cold wave of anger and betrayal washing over her. "Dreamed," she muttered to herself. What did he promise her? She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, determined to confront her father. Meanwhile, Daniel was taking a more calculated approach. He decided to spend some time with Jessica, hoping to glean information from her directly. He found her in the conservatory, tending to the plants as if she'd been doing it her entire life. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, trying to sound casual. Jessica looked up, her lips curling into that ever-present smile. "It is. Your mother loved this room, didn't she?" Daniel nodded, unsettled by the familiarity in her tone. "She did. Spent hours in here." Jessica sighed wistfully. "Margaret was a remarkable woman. She had a way of making everyone feel at home." Daniel tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "You knew her well, then?" "Oh, yes," Jessica replied, snipping a dead leaf from a fern. "We met years ago at a charity gala. She was kind enough to take me under her wing during a difficult time in my life." Her words were carefully chosen, revealing just enough to sound sincere without giving too much away. "What kind of difficult time?" Daniel pressed, his heart pounding. Jessica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, just personal struggles, nothing worth dredging up now." Daniel nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but his instincts told him she was lying. That evening, Emma and Daniel reconvened in her room, where she showed him the letter she'd found. "This changes everything," Daniel said, his voice low. "Dad wasn't just bringing her into the family after Mom's death. He was planning it before she even got sick." Emma nodded, her anger barely contained. "We need to confront him, together." But when they went to their father's study, they found the door locked. "Dad?" Emma called, knocking sharply. There was no answer. Emma exchanged a worried glance with Daniel, and then, without hesitation, she reached for the spare key hidden above the doorframe. They let themselves in to find the study empty, but the desk drawers were open, papers scattered across the surface. One document caught Emma's eye, A freshly drafted will, still unsigned. She picked it up, her breath catching as she read. The will named Jessica Beaumont as the primary beneficiary of Richard's estate, with Emma and Daniel relegated to modest inheritances. The language was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the love and care that had defined their family's history. "This can't be real," Daniel said, staring at the document in disbelief. "It's real," Emma said, her voice trembling with rage. "And it proves everything we suspected. She's here to take everything." As they stood there, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Emma and Daniel exchanged a look, their resolve hardening. "It's time we got some answers," Emma said, clutching the will tightly. Downstairs, Jessica entered the house, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. But when she saw Emma and Daniel waiting for her in the foyer, the mask slipped for just a moment, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "Jessica," Emma said, holding up the will. "Care to explain this?" Jessica's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't think this is the time or place for such discussions." "Then when?" Daniel demanded. "After you've stolen everything from us." Jessica's gaze hardened, and for the first time the warmth in her voice vanished. "I suggest you talk to your father. He's the one who made his intentions clear." "We will," Emma said, her voice cold. "But make no mistake, this isn't over." As Jessica walked past them, heading toward the guest wing, Emma and Daniel knew they were racing against time. The truth was buried somewhere in the tangled web of secrets their father and Jessica had spun, and they were determined to uncover it before it was too late. The Whittaker siblings stood in the foyer long after Jessica disappeared into the guest wing. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, a suffocating mix of anger, betrayal, and a gnawing sense of urgency. "We need to confront Dad," Emma said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Agreed," Daniel replied, glancing at his watch. "But we can't do it like this. If we charge in with nothing but accusations, he'll just shut down or worse, defend her. We need more than this unsigned will." Emma nodded reluctantly. "You're right, but what else is there?" Daniel rubbed his temples, thinking hard. "Dad's been meticulous his whole life. If he changed the will, there's likely a paper trail, emails, notes, bank records. We need to find where he's been keeping his communications with Jessica." Their first stop was the study, the epicenter of their father's professional and personal affairs. As they rifled through drawers, file cabinets, and shelves, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on them. The room, once a place of warmth and authority, now felt like a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of trust. Emma pulled out a leather-bound journal from one of the drawers. "I didn't know Dad kept a personal diary." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think he'd be careless enough to write anything incriminating in there?" Emma flipped through the pages, scanning the neat handwriting. "Not incriminating maybe, but it could give us insight into his state of mind." She paused, on an entry dated 6 months before their mother's passing. March 15th. "Margaret has grown weaker. Every day feels like a countdown, and I'm ashamed of how my thoughts drift. Jessica has been my confidant, my escape. I know what we've shared is wrong, or at least the timing is. But with Margaret's light dimming, Jessica's presence is a beacon I can't resist." Emma closed the journal abruptly, her stomach churning. "What?" Daniel asked, noticing her reaction. She handed him the journal, her voice tight. "Read this." As Daniel read, his expression darkened. "So he was emotionally involved with her while Mom was dying, and he justifies it by calling her his beacon. Unbelievable." Emma set her jaw. "This is more than emotional infidelity. He was planning for a life with her before Mom even passed." Daniel placed the journal on the desk, his movements deliberate. "This still doesn't explain the will. Why would he leave nearly everything to her? What hold does she have on him?" The siblings decided to broaden their search, splitting up to cover more ground. Daniel headed to their father's bedroom while Emma combed through old financial records in the study. In the bedroom, Daniel opened the safe hidden behind a portrait. He knew the combination. His father had told him years ago, trusting his eldest son to handle family affairs if anything happened. Inside, he found a thick envelope labeled estate documents and a small jewelry box. Curious, he opened the box and found an engagement ring. A simple yet elegant design, clearly meant for Jessica. "Unbelievable," Daniel muttered under his breath. The envelope contained an updated will, signed and notarized, with Jessica as the primary beneficiary. Unlike the draft Emma had found, this one was final and legally binding. Meanwhile, Emma stumbled upon an email printout tucked inside a financial ledger. The email was from Jessica to their father, dated just days after their mother's funeral. Subject: "Moving forward, Richard, I know this is a difficult time, but we must focus on the future. The changes we discussed need to be implemented soon, both for the estate and for us. I'm here for you, as always. Love, Jessica." Emma clenched the paper in her hands, her anger flaring anew. It was clear that Jessica had been maneuvering herself into their father's life and his fortune for months, if not years. The siblings reconvened in the study, each bringing their findings. "She's already wearing Mom's jewelry, and now this," Daniel said, holding up the engagement ring. "He's planning to marry her." Emma laid the email on the desk next to the signed will. "She's not just after him, she's after everything, and Dad's letting it happen." Daniel shook his head, his frustration evident. "We can't wait any longer. We have to confront him tonight." That evening they found their father in the conservatory, sipping a glass of brandy. The golden light from the setting sun bathed the room, creating an almost serene atmosphere. "Dad," Emma said, stepping into the room with Daniel by her side. "We need to talk." Richard Whittaker looked up, his expression wary. "What is it?" Daniel placed the signed will and the email on the table in front of him. "This." Richard's eyes flicked over the documents before meeting his children's gazes. "So you've been snooping." "Snooping," Emma repeated, her voice rising. "You've betrayed everything Mom built for this family, and you call it snooping?" Richard sighed, setting down his glass. "You don't understand the complexities of the situation," Daniel scoffed. "Complexities? You replaced Mom before she was even gone, Dad. And now you're giving everything to her? It's not that simple," Richard said, his tone defensive. "Jessica has been there for me in ways you can't imagine. She's been a support system." Emma cut him off. "A support system? She's manipulating you, can't you see that?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I won't sit here and let you insult her. She's done nothing but love and care for me." "And the will," Daniel demanded. "What about us, your children? Do we mean so little to you that you'd give away our inheritance to someone you barely know?" Richard's face darkened. "This isn't about inheritance, it's about trust. And right now you two are showing me just how little you trust my judgment." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Emma took a step forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're not trying to hurt you, Dad. We're trying to protect what's left of this family. Can't you see that she's tearing us apart?" Richard didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the documents in front of him. As the confrontation ended without resolution, Emma and Daniel left the conservatory, their frustration and despair palpable. "Did we get through to him?" Emma asked as they climbed the stairs. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But if we didn't, we need to figure out what comes next. Because Jessica isn't going to stop." The siblings knew they were running out of time. With the will already finalized, their family's legacy hung by a thread, and the battle was far from over. The next morning, Emma and Daniel resolved to confront Jessica directly. Their father's evasiveness and the mounting evidence left them with no other option. If he wouldn't see reason, perhaps they could expose Jessica's motives outright. They waited until Jessica emerged from her guest suite looking effortlessly composed in a pale blue dress. She greeted them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone saccharine. "Isn't it a lovely day?" Emma wasted no time. "We need to talk." Jessica raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "About what?" "You know exactly what," Daniel said, his voice cold. Jessica's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered, her expression calm. "All right, let's talk." The three of them sat in the sunroom, the air thick with tension. Jessica folded her hands neatly in her lap, looking every bit the poised guest, while Emma and Daniel sat across from her, their body language stiff and defensive. "Let's not beat around the bush," Emma began. "We know about the will, the emails, the engagement ring. We know what you're doing." Jessica tilted her head slightly, her expression unbothered. "And what exactly do you think I'm doing?" "Manipulating our father," Daniel said bluntly. "You've wormed your way into his life, taken advantage of his grief, and now you're trying to take everything our mother built." Jessica laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down Emma's spine. "Is that what you think? That I'm some gold-digging villain in a soap opera?" Emma's jaw tightened. "We've seen the evidence. The emails, the will. Everything points to you using him for his money." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her demeanor shifting from polite to pointed. "Your father is a grown man. He's capable of making his own decisions. If he's chosen to trust me, to love me, that's his choice, not yours." "And the will," Daniel shot back. "Was that his choice too, or did you push him into it?" Jessica's eyes narrowed, her calm facade beginning to crack. "Your father came to me. He needed someone after your mother passed, and I was there for him. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine." Emma couldn't hold back any longer. "You had no right to step into our family like this. Mom wasn't even gone a week before you were parading around in her home." Jessica's lips curled into a thin smile. "Your father invited me here. And as for the will, maybe you should ask yourselves why he felt the need to make those changes. Perhaps he saw something in me that he didn't see in either of you." The accusation hit Emma and Daniel like a slap. Emma opened her mouth to retort, but Daniel placed a hand on her arm, silently urging her to stay calm. "You're good at deflecting," Daniel said evenly. "But we're not buying it. If you think we're going to stand by and let you take everything, you're sorely mistaken." Jessica's smile faded completely, replaced by a steely glare. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Emma leaned forward, meeting Jessica's gaze head-on. "Whatever it takes. We'll fight this, legally, emotionally, whatever it takes to protect our father and our mother's legacy." Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can try," she said, her voice low and sharp. "But don't underestimate me. Your father isn't the only one who's capable of making decisions." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emma and Daniel seething. After Jessica left, Emma paced the room, her anger bubbling over. "I can't believe her nerve. Did you hear what she said? Don't underestimate me. She's threatening us." Daniel sat back, his mind racing. "She's confident because she knows she has Dad wrapped around her finger. We need to find something that will wake him up, something he can't ignore." Emma paused, a thought dawning on her. "The lawyer, Dad's been working with Mr. Abbott for years. If anyone knows the details of the will, it's him." Daniel nodded. "Good idea, but we need to be careful. If Dad finds out we're digging into his affairs behind his back, it could make things worse." That afternoon, Emma and Daniel met with Mr. Abbott under the guise of seeking advice about estate planning for their own futures. The older man welcomed them into his office, his demeanor professional but warm. "What can I do for you two?" Mr. Abbott asked, adjusting his glasses. Emma hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Actually, we had some questions about Dad's estate. We've noticed a few changes lately, and we're concerned about how things are being handled." Mr. Abbott's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of caution crossing his face. "I'm not sure how much I can disclose without your father's consent." Daniel leaned forward, his tone earnest. "We're not asking you to break any rules. We just want to understand what's going on. Our dad isn't himself lately, and we think he might be making decisions he'll regret." Mr. Abbott studied them for a moment before sighing. "I can't give you specifics, but I will say this. Your father has made some significant changes to his estate plan in recent months. Changes that, frankly, surprised me." Emma's heart sank. "Do you think he was pressured into those changes?" Mr. Abbott hesitated before replying. "Your father seemed clear-headed when we discussed the revisions, but I've worked with him for decades and I could tell something was weighing on him. Whether that was grief, guilt, or something else, I can't say." Daniel exchanged a glance with Emma. "Thank you, Mr. Abbott. That helps more than you know." As they left the office, Emma turned to Daniel. "So Dad wasn't pressured, at least not overtly. But he's clearly not thinking straight." Daniel nodded, his jaw set. "Which means it's up to us to protect him from himself, and from Jessica." Emma took a deep breath. "Then we need a new plan. Something that will force him to see the truth, even if it hurts." Daniel's gaze hardened. "Agreed. And we'll start by finding out exactly what Jessica is hiding. Everyone has a weakness, even her." Determined to protect their father, Emma and Daniel launched a quiet but determined investigation into Jessica's past. They knew the woman had secrets. Her polished demeanor and rapid insertion into their father's life couldn't be the whole story. Their first step was to enlist the help of an old family friend, Claire Jensen, a former investigative journalist who had always been like an aunt to them. Claire had an impressive knack for uncovering truths, and she agreed to help without hesitation. "I've seen women like her before," Claire said, her voice crisp as she sipped her coffee. "They know exactly how to manipulate grief, how to seem like a savior while pulling the strings behind the scenes." Emma nodded. "We need to know everything about her, where she came from, what she's after, and what she's hiding." Within days, Claire returned with her first findings. Jessica Beaumont, it turned out, was not even her real name. "She's gone by at least 3 different aliases in the past 10 years, Claire revealed, spreading a series of documents across her dining room table. "Jessica Ross, Jessica Bennett, and now Jessica Beaumont. Each time she's associated with a wealthy older man, and each relationship ended with her receiving a substantial financial settlement." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents. "So she's done this before. But why change her name?" "Probably to avoid scrutiny," Claire explained. "If people started connecting the dots, her reputation would crumble. Changing her name gives her a clean slate every time." Emma leaned forward, her heart racing. "What about her finances? Is she in debt?" Claire nodded. "Her credit history is a mess. Bankruptcies, unpaid loans, maxed out credit cards, you name it. She's been living beyond her means for years. Your father is her golden ticket." Armed with this information, Emma and Daniel debated their next move. "We need to show Dad," Emma insisted. "If he sees what kind of person she really is, he'll have to reconsider." Daniel hesitated. "It's not that simple. If we confront him outright, he might dig his heels in. Jessica's already made us out to be the bad guys. If we push too hard, he could cut us off entirely." Emma sighed, frustration bubbling under the surface. So what do we do, just sit back and let her destroy everything? No, Daniel said firmly. We need undeniable proof, something so clear that even Dad can't ignore it. They decided to dig deeper, focusing on Jessica's connections in the local area. If she had a pattern of manipulation, there had to be someone who knew the truth. Claire tracked down one of Jessica's former partners, a man named Gerald Porter, who had been married to Jessica, or rather Jessica Ross, several years earlier. Gerald was initially reluctant to talk, but after some coaxing, he agreed to meet at a cafe in a nearby town. Emma and Daniel sat across from the older man, whose weathered face and tired eyes spoke of hard-earned lessons. Jessica was a whirlwind, Gerald began, his voice tinged with bitterness. She came into my life when I was vulnerable. My wife had just passed, and I was looking for someone to fill the void. She was everything I thought I needed. What happened? Emma asked gently. Gerald sighed. She was charming, attentive, and convincing, but once we got married, things started to change. She became demanding, controlling. She talked me into rewriting my will, giving her almost everything. Then, as soon as the ink was dry, she started withdrawing, emotionally, physically. She filed for divorce a year later and walked away with a fortune. Daniel clenched his fists. And you didn't see it coming. I was blind, Gerald admitted. I wanted to believe in her so badly that I ignored the signs. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. Emma and Daniel left the meeting with a renewed sense of urgency. We have to stop her, Emma said. If Dad rewrites the will completely in her favor, there's no telling what she'll do next. We will, Daniel promised. We just need more leverage. Their next breakthrough came unexpectedly. While reviewing Jessica's social media presence, Emma stumbled upon an old photograph buried deep in her account. Jessica with another man, laughing at what appeared to be a private party. That's not Dad, Emma said, showing the photo to Daniel. Daniel frowned. Who is he? They sent the photo to Claire, who identified the man as Victor Hartwell, a known real estate magnate notorious for his illicit dealings. Victor's got a reputation, Claire said over the phone. If Jessica was involved with him, it's not just money she's after, it's power. And if he's still in her life, that could mean trouble for your father. Armed with these findings, Emma and Daniel prepared for their confrontation. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they had no choice. Jessica had to be exposed, not just for their father's sake, but for the sake of their family's legacy. I just hope we're not too late, Emma said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. We won't be, Daniel assured her. We can't afford to be. The stage was set for their ultimate showdown with Jessica, and the stakes had never been higher. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Whittaker mansion, its golden light making the grand parlor feel almost ethereal. Richard Whittaker sat in his favorite armchair, the leather creaking slightly as he shifted his weight. His strong hands, still weathered from years of hard work, rested on the armrests, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between the past and present, between the memory of his late wife and the woman who now stood at his side. Jessica sat across from him, her fingers delicately tracing the rim of her wine glass, her eyes never leaving his. There was something unsettling about her composure, like a cat that had finally cornered its prey and was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Emma and Daniel stood at the threshold of the room, their faces a mixture of concern and determination. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and unfinished business. Dad, we need to talk, Emma said, her voice unsteady but firm. She wasn't going to back down this time. Richard turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied his children. About what, Emma? His tone was weary, a little defensive. It was the same way he spoke when he wanted to avoid conflict but was already bracing for it. Daniel stepped forward, his jaw set in that way that Emma knew meant he was ready to fight. We've been looking into some things, Dad. Things about Jessica, he said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her smile never wavering, but there was a flicker of tension in her eyes. I'm sure whatever you think you've found is just some misunderstanding, she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Richard knows me better than anyone. Emma couldn't contain herself. We're not talking about misunderstandings, Jessica. We're talking about facts. We found records of you changing your name, hiding your past, she gestured toward the documents in Daniel's hand, and manipulating men for money. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief, but Emma stood her ground. This was no longer about their father's relationship, it was about the truth, no matter how difficult it might be to hear. Enough, Richard's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His eyes flickered between Emma and Daniel, disappointment written all over his face. How dare you bring this up in front of Jessica? She's been nothing but supportive through the hardest time of my life. And now you're accusing her of what, trying to steal from me? Dad, we're not accusing her of anything, Daniel said quickly. We're just asking you to open your eyes. We've spoken to people who know her. People who've been through what you're going through, and we've seen the signs. We don't want you to end up like the men who came before you, used and discarded once she gets what she wants. Jessica's face hardened. You really think I'm using Richard? After everything we've been through, I'm here because I love him. I don't care about his money or his past. Her voice trembled with fake sincerity. Love? Emma scoffed. How can you talk about love when everything you've done has been for your own gain? Richard's expression darkened, his patience snapping. You've crossed a line, both of you. I've made my choice, and it's not for you to decide who's worthy of my affection. His eyes flicked to Jessica, then back to his children, as if daring them to challenge him further. Emma's heart broke, but she refused to back down. We're trying to protect you, Dad. We're trying to save you from making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. Save me? Richard's voice grew louder, the vein in his neck pulsing with rage. You think I don't know what's best for me? You're the ones who are blinded by your own insecurities, thinking that I can't move on from your mother's death. I'm not a child. I'm a man who can still make his own decisions. Emma flinched at the harshness in his words, but Daniel stepped forward again, trying to de-escalate the situation. Dad, we don't want to hurt you. We just don't want you to get hurt either. You can't let her control everything. Please, just listen to us. Jessica rose from her chair, the steel in her posture radiating confidence. I think it's best if you leave, she said, her voice cold and cutting. Richard and I need some time alone to discuss this. Richard's eyes softened, but the damage was done. I don't need you two coming in here causing trouble. I've made my decision, and I won't be swayed. Now please leave us be. The ride home was silent, the tension between Emma and Daniel palpable. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't know what hurt more, the fact that their father had rejected their pleas or the look of betrayal in his eyes. Do you think we did the right thing? Daniel asked, his voice low, filled with doubt. Emma sighed. I don't know, but we had to try. If we don't speak up now, who will? We can't just sit back and watch him be taken advantage of. Daniel nodded, but the uncertainty in his expression mirrored Emma's own. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The Whittaker family was about to face a battle that would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, love, and betrayal. At the Whittaker mansion, Richard sat in the parlor long after his children had left, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. He was alone, but Jessica's presence filled the room. There was a deep sense of finality in the air, a feeling that once this decision was made, it couldn't be undone. Would the truth eventually come to light? Or had Jessica already secured her hold on the Whittaker legacy? The future, like the present, remained uncertain, but Richard had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The days following the confrontation between Richard and his children were tense. Richard had closed himself off from both Emma and Daniel, shutting down any attempt at further communication. But he was also more distant than ever from Jessica, as doubts about her intentions began to gnaw at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but his pride and his desire to protect the life he had built with Jessica prevented him from fully confronting it. One evening, after another quiet dinner where Jessica's chatter about their plans for the future seemed louder than ever, Richard sat alone in the study. The room felt different, colder somehow. He sat behind his massive oak desk, his hands folded tightly in front of him, staring at the family portraits lining the walls, his wife's smile frozen in time, his children's faces from when they were younger and less complicated. Everything seemed so distant now. Suddenly the door creaked open and Jessica stepped in. Her face was a mask of concern, but Richard could tell it wasn't entirely genuine. You've been distant lately, she said, her voice soft, almost seductive. Is everything okay? Richard didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on a picture of his late wife, the woman who had shared his life for so many years. He could almost feel her presence, as if she were silently watching him from beyond the grave. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Richard finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could move on, but something feels off. I feel like I've made a terrible mistake. Jessica stepped closer, her face a mixture of concern and calculation. Richard, what are you talking about? We've been through so much together. You can't let their words get to you. They don't understand us. They don't know what we have. Her hand rested on his shoulder, but Richard barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the swirl of his conflicting thoughts. Could he truly trust her, or was he just another pawn in her game? I've been thinking, Richard said slowly, his voice uncertain, about the will, about what it all means. Jessica froze. Her fingers tightened briefly on his shoulder before she masked her discomfort with a smooth, reassuring smile. "What about the will?" she asked, her tone now steely, businesslike. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he examined her. "The will, the way everything was left to you, it's too perfect, too convenient. You don't think there's anything strange about that?" Jessica's gaze flickered for a split second, just enough for Richard to notice. But her composure returned immediately. "You're overthinking this, Richard. Your wife loved you, and she knew how much I loved you. She knew I would take care of you." Richard's heart clenched, but he wasn't ready to believe the comforting words just yet. "You're telling me that this wasn't all planned out, that you didn't have a hand in that will, that it wasn't a setup?" Jessica stepped back, her posture straightening. "How dare you?" she said, her voice suddenly colder. "You think I'm capable of doing something like that? I've been nothing but loyal to you since the day we met." Richard didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe in the love she claimed to have for him, but everything about their relationship now seemed clouded by suspicion. His mind went back to the strange behavior of the past weeks, the secrecy, the way she had shielded him from certain family discussions, the absence of any real emotional connection between them beyond physical intimacy. He thought about Emma and Daniel and their warnings, how they had tried to protect him from himself. How had it come to this? "I need some time to think," Richard finally said, his voice firm. "I can't do this anymore, Jessica. I don't know who you are anymore." She stared at him, a flicker of anger crossing her features before quickly disappearing behind a facade of hurt. "If that's how you feel, Richard, then maybe you should reconsider everything. I won't beg for your love." With a final glance at him, Jessica turned and walked out of the study, leaving Richard alone once again. The weight of the silence pressed in on him, filling the room with a suffocating sense of isolation. As the days went on, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the choices he had made, choices that had led him down a path of regret and confusion. He began to question everything: his past with Jessica, the quick decision to change his will, and the part of him that had been too eager to escape the grief of his wife's passing. Meanwhile, Emma and Daniel hadn't given up on their father. They continued their research, digging into Jessica's past, making discreet phone calls, and seeking out former acquaintances who might offer insight. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. One evening, Emma sat at her kitchen table, a stack of documents in front of her. She had finally found the piece of information they needed: a record of Jessica's previous relationships, some of them with men much wealthier than Richard. There was no direct proof that she had manipulated him, but it was becoming clearer that her pattern was far from innocent. She placed the documents in a folder and stared at the photo of her father and Jessica that had been taken on their last anniversary. Richard's eyes were bright with hope, and Jessica's smile was as flawless as it had been from the beginning. Emma's heart sank as she realized how deeply her father had been taken in. But it wasn't too late. Emma wasn't ready to give up. She had to find a way to get through to her father before Jessica's hold on him became irreversible. It wasn't just about protecting the family fortune anymore. It was about protecting Richard from making the biggest mistake of his life. Richard sat in the parlor that evening, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, his thoughts tangled in confusion. The finality of his conversation with Jessica weighed heavily on him, but he knew that whatever came next, the life he had once known would never be the same. The question was no longer whether Jessica could be trusted. It was whether he could trust himself to make the right decision before everything slipped beyond his control. In the quiet of the mansion, Richard realized that the battle for his future wasn't just about love, it was about redemption. And perhaps, with the right choice, he could still find a way to reclaim it. This decision would change everything. But the question remained: would it be too late? Would Richard's family finally have the opportunity to save him? Or was Jessica already too deeply embedded in his life to be dislodged? Richard stood in the middle of the grand foyer, looking at the door to his study. It had been days since his conversation with Jessica, and despite his initial resolve, he hadn't found the courage to follow through. His mind felt like it was in a constant state of turmoil, the emotional gravity of the situation pulling him in all directions. He had hoped that time would give him clarity, but all it had done was leave him more uncertain than before. He knew he had to act soon. He couldn't keep living in limbo, caught between a life that felt like it was slipping through his fingers and the reality of his children's growing concerns. Emma had been calling him every day, each conversation more insistent than the last, urging him to confront Jessica once and for all. Daniel, ever the quiet one, had slipped him an article about manipulation in relationships. leaving it in his study without a word. The message was clear, even if it hadn't been spoken. Jessica wasn't the person she appeared to be. It was late in the evening when Richard finally decided he would meet with his children. He hadn't wanted to burden them with his personal struggles, but the truth was, they had already been burdened by his silence and indecision. The time for secrets was over. If he was going to reclaim his life and his family, he would need to be honest with them and with himself. "Father, we need to talk," Emma said when she walked into the study the next evening. Her tone was firm but tinged with a weariness that Richard hadn't noticed before. She had never spoken to him this way, and it struck him like a bolt of lightning. "About what?" Richard asked, looking up from his desk. He had been expecting this conversation for days, but now that it was happening he wasn't ready. Emma crossed the room, standing at the edge of his desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "About Jessica," she said bluntly. "We've done our research, Dad. She's not who you think she is." Richard's stomach clenched. The words that Emma had just spoken hit him harder than he anticipated. "What do you mean?" he asked, although he already knew. The truth had been creeping up on him for weeks and it was finally pushing its way into the open. "I mean that she's not just some innocent woman grieving over a lost love," Emma continued. "She's been involved with men before you, all of them wealthy, all of them with something to lose. You're just the latest in a long line of men she's manipulated. I don't know what she told you, but we know who she really is." Richard stood up, his pulse quickening. He felt his mind racing, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He had refused to believe it. But now there was no denying that Emma was right. "I don't want to hear this," Richard said, though the words felt empty as soon as they left his mouth. "I want to believe she loves me. I can't just throw that away." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his vulnerability. Emma shook her head, a look of frustration and concern in her eyes. "Dad, we know you want to believe in her, but look at what it's costing you. You've lost sight of everything that matters, your family, your integrity, yourself." Richard didn't respond. He couldn't. The realization that he had been blind for so long was almost too much to bear. He had spent decades building a life of wealth, stability, and status, and now, with one decision, it all seemed to be crumbling. His pride had kept him from seeing the truth, but now it was clear. Jessica had used him, and in the process, she had driven a wedge between him and his children. "I don't know what to do," Richard admitted, his voice quieter now, filled with the weight of defeat. "I don't know how to undo what I've done." Emma reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "It's not too late, Dad, but you need to make a choice. You need to choose us." Daniel stepped into the room at that moment, his usual silence broken only by the weight of his presence. "She's not good for you, Dad. We've seen the signs. You need to let go before it's too late." Richard's eyes moved between his two children, the overwhelming love and the sharp pain in their expressions making it impossible for him to look away. His children were right, and he had known it for a long time. The only thing that had kept him from acting sooner was the fear of facing the consequences of his decisions. But now, as he looked at Emma and Daniel, he realized something he had been too afraid to admit before. The consequences of staying with Jessica were far worse. His chest tightened with emotion as he felt the weight of the moment. He had been given a second chance, a chance to undo the damage and rebuild his relationship with his children. But it meant letting go of the woman he had trusted, the woman he had thought would be his future. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly, looking at his children. "I should have listened to you both sooner." Emma nodded, a soft smile of relief spreading across her face. "It's not too late, Dad. We'll help you through this. We're a family and we'll get through it together." Richard stood there for a moment, the room feeling suddenly lighter. For the first time in weeks he felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do. Later that night Richard sat down with Jessica. His heart was heavy, but his mind was clear. He had made his decision. The time for truth was now. "Jessica," he began, his voice steady but resolute, "I've made a mistake, a big one." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Richard swallowed hard. "I've been blind to everything that's been happening. I've put my trust in you when I should have trusted my children. I've hurt them, and I've hurt myself. It's over." Jessica's face hardened, her gaze sharp as she stood up. "You can't be serious. After everything I've done for you, I was wrong," Richard said, his voice firm. "You're not who I thought you were, and I can't keep living this lie." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then, with a sharp exhale, Jessica turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Richard sat back, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. It was done. The battle for his future had been fought, and now he had to rebuild. But as he watched Jessica disappear from his life, he knew that this was the first step toward healing. The second step was taking his family's love and trust and proving to them, and to himself, that he could be the man they always believed he was. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt hope, and that was all he needed to begin again. Weeks had passed since Richard's confrontation with Jessica, and though the house felt emptier without her presence, a quiet peace had settled in its place. The echoes of her departure lingered, but so did a sense of liberation. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he could breathe again. It wasn't easy, though. The process of rebuilding his life, his relationships, his sense of self, had required more than just a decision to part ways with Jessica. It required understanding the depth of the damage he had caused, the bridges he had burned, and the time he had wasted. But he had made the hardest decision of all. To choose his family over everything else. Emma and Daniel had been his pillars of strength, but they had also been the ones to force him to confront the truth. They had urged him to see what he had been too blind to acknowledge. Now, with their support, he was learning how to navigate a life that no longer revolved around wealth, status, and the promises of a woman who never truly cared for him. One evening, Richard sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old album. It was filled with pictures of him and his late wife, Sophia. He smiled at the memories, the moments of joy and love that they had shared. Those memories, however, were tainted by the years of neglect he had given to his marriage. He had been so consumed by ambition, by the desire to prove his worth to the world, that he had forgotten the importance of the quiet moments at home, the moments that truly mattered. Emma entered the room, breaking his reverie. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, laced with concern, but there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. Richard looked up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. She had forgiven him, both of his children had forgiven him. "I'm getting there," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I'm trying to make things right." "You already have," Emma said, sitting down beside him. "You're here. That's all we wanted." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had been so afraid of losing them, of having to face the consequences of his actions. But in reality, the only thing that had ever mattered was being present for them, being a father they could rely on, someone who would be there for the long haul. Richard placed the photo album aside and looked at his daughter. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it. And I promise I'll keep proving to you both that I can be the father you deserve." Emma smiled, and Richard could see the burden she had been carrying for so long slowly lifting. "We'll work through it together, Dad, one day at a time." Later that evening, the three of them sat down for dinner. The table filled with laughter and stories of Emma's latest adventures at work, and Daniel's newfound interest in photography. The air felt lighter, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that healing would take time, but for the first time in a long time he was on the right path. As they finished dinner, Daniel stood up, his voice more serious than usual. "Dad, I want you to know something. I never thought we'd get to this point, but I'm proud of you. You've shown us that you're willing to change, to make things right. And that's all we ever wanted." Richard's heart swelled at the words. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more to me than you'll ever know." In that moment, Richard realized that the real fortune he had spent his life seeking wasn't in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the love and trust of his children. He had lost sight of that for far too long. But now, with the past behind him, and a renewed sense of purpose, he knew that the rest of his life could be about something far more valuable than money or power. It could be about rebuilding the connections that truly mattered. As he looked around the table, surrounded by his children, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a fresh start, a chance to be the man, the father, and the person he had always wanted to be. The future was uncertain, but as Richard stood up ready to face whatever came next, he felt confident for the first time in years. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer walking it alone. And for the first time in a long time, he truly felt like he was home. As we reach the end of Richard's story, it's clear that sometimes the path to redemption isn't as straightforward as we'd hope. The shocking revelations in the will turned his life upside down, but in the end it was his willingness to face the truth that allowed him to rebuild the relationships he nearly lost. What do you think? Could Richard truly make amends, or was the damage too much to repair? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales of love, betrayal, and second chances. Thank you for listening to this story, and I will see you in the next one.